There's a specific moment in every awakening, a moment when you suddenly realize with crystal clarity that the life you've been living isn't actually yours. You've been performing a role, following a script written by other people's expectations, living according to rules you never consciously agreed to follow. And in that moment of recognition, everything changes. Because once you see that you've been living for others, you can never unsee it. And that's when the real question emerges. Are you brave enough to start living for yourself? Carl Jung spent his entire life studying this phenomenon, the way we abandon our authentic selves to fit into the molds that society, family, and culture have prepared for us. He watched people sacrifice their deepest truths, suppress their genuine desires, and contort themselves into shapes that pleased everyone except themselves. And he understood something profound. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But most people never claim this privilege. They live their entire lives as strangers to themselves, dying without ever having truly lived. They make choices based on what will gain approval, rather than what resonates with their soul. They pursue careers that look impressive, rather than ones that feel meaningful. They maintain relationships that drain them because they're terrified of being alone. They speak words that please others while their authentic voice remains silent. This isn't living, it's performing. And the tragedy is that most people don't even realize they're doing it. They've been playing the role for so long that they've forgotten there's a real person underneath the persona. They've become so identified with others' perceptions of them that they've lost touch with their own inner knowing. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to be acceptable to the world. And he understood that while we all need a persona to function in society, the danger comes when we become completely identified with this mask, when we forget that there's an authentic self beneath the performance, when we start believing that we are the role we're playing. The person who lives entirely for others has usually learned this pattern early in life. Perhaps they discovered that love was conditional, that they would only be accepted if they behaved in certain ways, achieved certain things, or suppressed certain parts of themselves. Maybe they learned that their authentic self was too much, too sensitive, too intense, or somehow unacceptable. So they adapted. They learned to read the room, to sense what others wanted, to become whoever they needed to be, to gain approval and avoid rejection. This adaptation makes sense in childhood, when your survival depends on your caregiver's approval. But what begins as a survival strategy becomes a prison in adulthood. You become so skilled at being what others need that you lose touch with what you need. You become so attuned to others' emotions that you can't access your own. You become so good at pleasing everyone else that you forget how to please yourself. Living this way creates a particular kind of suffering, a deep existential exhaustion that comes from constantly betraying yourself. You might achieve all the external markers of success. You might be admired, respected, even loved by many people, but inside there's a hollowness, a sense that something essential is missing, because no amount of external approval can fill the void created by self-abandonment. Jung understood that this void, this feeling of something missing, is actually your authentic self crying out for recognition. It's your soul demanding to be lived rather than suppressed. It's your true nature refusing to be ignored any longer. And the symptoms of this inner rebellion manifest in many ways: depression, anxiety, physical illness, addictions, a sense of meaninglessness, or a quiet desperation that haunts even your moments of supposed success. This desperation often intensifies during what Jung called the midlife crisis, though it can happen at any age. It's the moment when you can no longer ignore the gap between who you're pretending to be and who you actually are. The masks start to crack. The performance becomes exhausting. The rewards of others' approval no longer feel worth the price of self-betrayal. Some people respond to this crisis by doubling down on their performance, working harder to maintain the image, achieving more to silence the inner voice. Others self-destruct, burning down their lives in dramatic ways as their suppressed authentic self explodes into consciousness. But Jung offered a third path, conscious individuation, the deliberate journey of becoming who you truly are. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. You don't have to wait for a crisis to begin living authentically. You don't have to wait until the pain of self-betrayal becomes unbearable. The day you stop living for others and start living for yourself isn't some distant possibility. It's a choice available to you right now, in this moment. It's the decision to stop betraying your authentic self and start honoring it instead. This decision isn't comfortable. In fact, it's terrifying for most people because living for yourself means disappointing others. It means setting boundaries that some people won't like. It means making choices that others won't understand. It means potentially losing relationships that were based on you being someone you're not. It means stepping into the unknown territory of your authentic self when the familiar territory of your false self feels safer. But Jung would tell you that this discomfort is the price of becoming real. As he discovered through his research on individuation, becoming who you truly are requires separating yourself from the collective, from the mass of people who live unconsciously according to society's scripts. It requires having the courage to stand alone, to be misunderstood, to risk rejection in service of your own truth. This process begins with a radical act of self-honesty. You must be willing to look at your life and ask, how much of what I'm doing is genuinely mine and how much is performance for others? This question can be devastating because the answer often reveals how little of your life actually belongs to you. Your career might be your parents' dream rather than yours. Your relationships might be based on obligation rather than genuine connection. Your daily choices might be driven by fear of judgment rather than authentic desire. Consider the person who became a doctor because their family expected it, though they dreamed of being an artist. Or the individual who stays in a marriage that died years ago because divorce seems like failure. Or the one who maintains friendships that drain them because they fear being alone. These aren't isolated examples. They're patterns that run through millions of lives, creating a collective epidemic of inauthenticity. But this recognition, as painful as it is also liberating. Because once you see how you've been living for others, you can begin to make different choices. You can start to ask yourself what you actually want, not what you think you should want. You can begin to notice what genuinely resonates with your soul versus what you do to maintain your image. You can start to distinguish between your authentic voice and the internalized voices of all the people you've been trying to please. Jung called this process withdrawing your projections. You begin to see that many of your life choices were not really choices at all. They were reactions to others' expectations that you internalized and made your own. You start to recognize that the critical voice in your head might not be your voice at all, but rather the accumulated judgments of everyone who ever told you that your authentic self wasn't acceptable. This work of separating what's truly yours from what's been imposed on you requires tremendous psychological courage. It means questioning everything you've taken for granted about yourself. It means examining beliefs you've held since childhood and asking, is this actually true for me, or is this something I learned to believe? It means testing assumptions about who you should be and discovering who you actually are. As you do this work of separation and individuation, you'll likely experience what Jung called the dark night of the soul. This is the period when your old identity is dying, but your new one hasn't fully emerged yet. You know who you don't want to be anymore, but you're not yet clear on who you truly are. This liminal space is disorienting and uncomfortable, but it's absolutely necessary for transformation. During this transition, you might feel lost. You might question whether you're making a terrible mistake by disrupting the life you've built. You might experience grief for the years you spent living inauthentically, anger at the people and systems that demanded your false self, or fear about who you'll become if you let go of who you've been pretending to be. Jung would tell you that these feelings are not signs that you're on the wrong path. They're evidence that you're on exactly the right one. The death of your false self is supposed to feel like a death. The emergence of your authentic self is supposed to feel uncertain and vulnerable. This discomfort isn't something to avoid, it's something to move through with consciousness and courage. During this transition, you'll face resistance, both internal and external. Internally, you'll encounter fear. Fear of being rejected if people see your real self. Fear of making choices that others won't approve of. Fear of discovering that underneath all the performance, you don't know who you really are. These fears are normal, but they're not reasons to turn back. They're simply the old patterns fighting for their survival. Your psyche has invested years, perhaps decades, in maintaining your false self. It's created elaborate defense mechanisms to protect this constructed identity. As you begin to dismantle these defenses and question this identity, your unconscious will push back. You might experience resistance in the form of procrastination, self-sabotage, sudden doubts, or compelling reasons why now isn't the right time to change. Externally, you'll likely face pushback from people who are invested in your old role. When you stop being who others need you to be and start being who you actually are, some people won't like it. They may criticize you, try to guilt you back into your old patterns, or even withdraw from the relationship entirely. This is painful, but it's also clarifying. It reveals who was actually interested in knowing you versus who was simply enjoying the services you provided or the role you played. The people who truly love you will support your journey toward authenticity, even if it's uncomfortable for them at times. They'll recognize that a real relationship with your authentic self is more valuable than a false relationship with your performed self. But those who were invested in keeping you small, compliant, or useful will resist your transformation. And you'll have to decide whether maintaining their approval is worth continuing to betray yourself. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes not just psychological theory, but lived reality. You're literally separating yourself from the collective expectations, the family systems, the cultural conditioning that shaped your false self. You're claiming your right to exist as a unique individual rather than as a role in someone else's story. But as you continue choosing yourself, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start to discover who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and performance. You begin to access parts of yourself that have been dormant or suppressed for years, maybe decades. You find interests, passions, and desires that are genuinely yours, not borrowed from others' expectations. You might discover that you have opinions you never expressed because they didn't align with your crowd. You might realize you have gifts you never developed because they didn't fit the career path that was expected of you. You might find that you have emotions you've been suppressing because they weren't acceptable in your family or culture. As you give yourself permission to explore these hidden aspects, you start to feel more alive, more real, more yourself. You also discover a different kind of energy. When you're living authentically, you're no longer exhausted by the constant performance of being someone you're not. Yes, you'll still face challenges and difficulties, but they'll be the real challenges of your actual life rather than the false struggles of maintaining an inauthentic existence. There's a profound difference between the exhaustion that comes from living someone else's life and the fatigue that comes from living your own. Jung believed that this authentic way of living, what he called individuation, is not just a personal journey but a spiritual one. You're not just becoming more psychologically healthy, you're actually fulfilling your soul's purpose. Every person has a unique essence, a particular way of being that is theirs alone to express. When you live for others, you deny this essence. When you claim your authentic life, you honor it. This doesn't mean you become selfish or stop caring about others. In fact, Jung discovered the opposite. When you're living authentically, you become more capable of genuine love and service. Because you're no longer giving from a place of depletion and resentment. You're giving from a place of overflow and choice. You're not helping others because you need their approval. You're helping them because it genuinely aligns with who you are. The relationships that survive your transformation and the new relationships you attract will be qualitatively different. They'll be based on mutual authenticity rather than mutual performance. You'll be loved for who you truly are rather than for the mask you wear. And this kind of love, though it may be less abundant than the approval you received for performing, is infinitely more nourishing because it's real. When you stop living for others, you also stop needing others to live for you. You release the unconscious expectation that people should sacrifice themselves for your approval, just as you once sacrificed yourself for theirs. This creates space for relationships based on mutual respect for each person's authentic journey rather than mutual enforcement of false selves. Living authentically also changes how you experience challenges and setbacks. When you're living someone else's life, every obstacle feels like a personal failure. But when you're living your own life, challenges become part of the journey rather than evidence that you're on the wrong path. You develop resilience because you're committed to your authentic path, not just to maintaining others' approval. You learn to trust yourself in ways you never could when you were constantly seeking external validation. You develop an internal compass that guides your decisions based on what feels true for you rather than what looks good to others. This doesn't mean you become rigid or closed to feedback. It means you are able to consider others' perspectives without automatically abandoning your own. Jung understood that individuation, becoming who you truly are, is not a destination but a continuous process. There's no finish line where you've finally made it and can rest on your authentic laurels. Every day presents new choices between living authentically and falling back into performance. Every interaction offers an opportunity to either speak your truth or tell people what they want to hear. Every decision is a chance to honor yourself or betray yourself once again. But each time you choose authenticity, it becomes easier. Each time you honor your genuine feelings instead of performing the expected emotions, you strengthen your connection to yourself. Each time you make a choice based on your authentic desires rather than others' expectations, you reclaim a piece of your soul. Over time, these individual choices accumulate into a completely different way of being in the world. You start to notice that you feel more grounded, more present, more solid in yourself. The constant anxiety of wondering what others think begins to fade. The exhausting mental gymnastics of trying to predict and meet everyone's expectations becomes less automatic. You develop what Jung called psychological solidity, a core sense of self that is undependent on external validation. This doesn't happen overnight. The patterns of living for others are often deeply ingrained, reinforced over decades of conditioning and practice. You'll have moments when you backslide into old habits. You'll catch yourself performing for approval, suppressing your truth to keep the peace, or choosing others' comfort over your own authenticity. This is normal and expected. The goal isn't perfection, it's consciousness. Each time you notice yourself falling back into old patterns, you have an opportunity to make a different choice. Maybe not immediately. Maybe you'll complete the performance and only afterward realize what you've done. But that awareness itself is progress. Over time, the gap between the automatic pattern and your conscious recognition of it shrinks. Eventually, you start catching yourself in the moment and can choose differently in real time. The day you truly stop living for others isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a series of small, courageous choices that accumulate over time. It's the day you finally say no to a request that doesn't align with your truth. It's the moment you express an opinion that might be unpopular. It's the choice to pursue what genuinely calls to you rather than what looks good on paper. It's the decision to leave a relationship that requires you to be less than who you are. It's the courage to disappoint others in service of being true to yourself. And here's what Jung would want you to know. You don't need permission to live your own life. You don't need to wait until you've proven your worth or achieved enough success or finally become ready. You don't need others' approval to honor your own soul. The only permission you need is the permission you give yourself, the radical decision to stop abandoning yourself and start showing up as who you truly are. This decision will change everything. Not because your external circumstances will magically transform overnight, but because you will transform. You'll move through the world differently when you're no longer carrying the exhausting burden of constant performance. You'll make different choices when you're connected to your authentic desires rather than others' expectations. You'll attract different experiences when you're broadcasting the frequency of your true self rather than your false persona. You'll also develop a different relationship with solitude. When you're living for others, being alone feels threatening because you lose the external validation that props up your false self. But when you're living authentically, solitude becomes nourishing, a chance to reconnect with yourself without the noise of others' expectations. You discover that you enjoy your own company because you're finally being yourself. The privilege of a lifetime, as Jung said, is to become who you truly are. But this privilege isn't given. It's claimed. It's claimed through the courageous act of stopping your lifelong performance and finally living the life that's been waiting for you all along. The life that's yours and yours alone. The life that doesn't need anyone's approval because it's rooted in the deepest truth of who you are. This is the invitation that Jung offers across the decades, to have the courage to disappoint others in service of meeting yourself, to risk being misunderstood in exchange for being real, to trade the exhausting performance of acceptability for the liberating authenticity of selfhood, to stop living the life others designed for you and start living the life your soul intended. The journey won't always be easy. There will be moments of doubt, periods of disorientation, and times when you wonder if you're making a terrible mistake. But underneath these surface challenges, you'll feel something you may not have felt in years, or perhaps ever. The deep satisfaction of living in alignment with your own truth. The quiet joy of making choices that honor who you actually are. The profound relief of no longer betraying yourself for others' approval. If you've felt the stirring of recognition as you've absorbed these words, if something in you is saying, yes, this is what I've been missing, then you are ready. You are ready to stop living for others and start living for yourself. You are ready to claim the privilege of becoming who you truly are. Write in the comments, I choose my authentic life, and let that declaration mark the beginning of your real journey. Share this message with someone who needs permission to stop performing and start living. Your authentic self has been waiting. Will you finally answer its call?